Welcome back. I want to first of all apologize for not getting a lecture to you before now, but I'm having trouble with my internet uploading the full 45, 50 minutes of a lecture at home. So I am now going to shorten the lecture to between 25 and 30 minutes and see if I have the capability to upload that. It will not upload a 50-minute lecture from home. So bear with me as I work my way through this to get information to you. Okay? All right, hope everybody's okay. And managing this stay-at-home stuff. All right, let's begin with Chapter 8. In Chapter 8 is the development of speech, sounds, and cultural variations. Now, we know that children learn speech and language at the same time, but speech and language are different. They are not one and the same thing. They learn the rules of speech and they learn the underlying rules of language, but they are different. So don't confuse speech and language as being synonymous. They are not the same thing, do not mean the same thing, although they are very connected. We've discussed in the past, speech without language is the parrot talking. Hello, hello. Welcome home, and they have these structured, rehearsed phrases that they say, but a parrot is unable to remember something that happened 2 weeks ago and bring that forward to talk about it. It is highly structured and scripted speech. There is no language capability in that parrot. Now, language without speech, for example, could be someone who has had a stroke. They no longer have the capability to produce speech, but they seem to understand receptively everything that's going on. And that speech isn't there, but the language seems to be there. Now, there could be an impairment, but they know what you're talking about. They want to interact, they want to engage in a conversation, but the speech component is where the damage was done in the brain. But they understand, they remember things from the past, they have vocabulary, they remember vocabulary, and may have the capability to learn new vocabulary. So speech and language are very different, but they do work together. And speech and language develop at a different pace. There is progress. There is a sequence of what happens, just like everything else we've talked about in terms of language and how children acquire language and the development of syntax and semantics. It is over a continuum of time. If a child has articulation errors, we may or may not pick them up. It depends on your ear training. And in some of your projects, I thought, I think I hear a lisp. I'm not sure, but boy, that sound at the end of the word cars sounds very thick. And that's how I describe it. Cars, cars, cars. You hear this subtle difference. If I point it out to you, you go, oh yeah, there it is. But it can be very, very subtle. My ear is trained, and I pick up those differences. Now again, in your paper, many of you picked up some articulation errors of the students or the kiddos that you worked with. And that F substitution for a TH, a D substitution for a G, a W substitution for an L, or maybe even a W substitution for that R, and you did pick those up. Some of those are far more obvious. The S is a little more challenging, but we don't really pay attention to the speech sounds as much unless we pick up some kind of an error. We know phonology. You've written about that in your papers, the study of speech sounds and the rules. And as you can see, phonology, syntax, morphology, pragmatics, they've all been ingrained, enmeshed in almost all of the chapters, because you can't really talk about language unless you talk about those 5 areas. One way, as a speech pathologist, I can analyze a child's phonology or articulation is to use the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA, and it is in your PowerPoint on page 135. If a child is highly unintelligible, I'll record them. I'll go back and listen to them probably multiple times, because I'm going to transcribe in phonetics what they've said and how they say it. Now, the phonetics is, they use symbols. Now, some of the phonetic alphabet, a B is a B, a D is a D. But when we get into SH and CH and sounds such as Z, as in the word measure, we use different symbols that are a little more abstract. But if I have a child that's highly unintelligible, I can record it, transcribe it phonetically, and it's going to tell me where that child has articulation patterns. And it's going to help me determine where I will start in therapy. My goals, it will help me determine my goals. Now, some of you who are elementary education majors and special education majors, you may think, oh my gosh, do I have to learn that? No, you don't. It's more for speech pathologists who have to analyze very specifically how a child says something. Now, also, I want to make you aware of words that we spell differently than we say. How would you say Letter? It's got 2 T's in the middle. T says T, but the word is letter, not letter, letter. So you see how when you put a sound next to another sound, it changes the dynamics of a sound. That's called co-articulation. How a sound changes based on a sound that is next to it and bringing some different features into that sound. If you say Little, that's the word little. Now, it doesn't really sound like the T, sounds more like the D because of the co-articulation, the adjacent sounds that change the dynamics of how we say other sounds. We also look at articulation in reference to the place of articulation, and the place of articulation identifies where in the oral cavity the articulatory contact is made. We've talked about articulators, the tongue, the teeth, the lips, and so forth. We also look at manner of articulation, and it describes how a consonant sound is produced. For example, some sounds we call stops. And if you look at the PowerPoint on 135, you'll see that the the stop sounds are ba, p, t, and da, along with k and ga. That means that you've started the sound and you've stopped the flow of air out of the mouth, and then you suddenly release it. P, p, ba. They're made exactly the same on the lips. The difference is voicing. And that's another feature. It involves the vocal fold vibration, and if you're vibrating those vocal cords. So I have symbols for voiced and symbols for voiceless. And it sounds a little complicated, and in a way it is, but it's sort of fascinating once you're able to transcribe a child's speech and get a feel for, oh my gosh, this child is really producing almost all the sounds in the front of their mouths. Again, that's more for the speech pathologist than it is for you special ed and LEd majors. When we classify vowels, because we've talked about consonants, it's much more difficult. A, E, I, O, U. We have long vowels, we have short vowels, and the classification for the vowels is the height of the tongue, it's the location of the primary resonance, and the tension of the tongue. Now remember, the oral cavity is a resonating cavity. That's where sound resonates, along with the nasal cavity and the pharyngeal cavity. So vowels are classified a little bit differently, but in terms of how they develop and how we transcribe, a lot of times I'll talk about vowels as being distorted. It's not an a, it's not an a, it's somewhere in between, and I might classify it as a distortion. That's really all that I want to say about the phonetic alphabet, just simply because it's the SPA majors will get more of that in some of their other classes. We know that infants learn to communicate very early, and it may just be a cry. And we know that there's an explosion of language, and we know how many words they should have by a certain age. We see and know that the vocabulary explodes around the age of 2, and the use of morphology. Those things are also mentioned in the book and in this particular chapter, but I don't really want to concentrate on that too much because we've already talked about that quite a bit. We talk about how the child experiments with sounds. Listening to yourself is very important. So for a hearing impaired child, it could be a bit different. We've talked about cooing. We've talked about babbling. We've also talked about how you can put 4 children from a different culture speaking in a home where they speak a different language, and those children, those infants, toddlers, more toddler, they will sound the same. So we have the capability to produce any sound from any language. As time goes on, a few more months, and our influence in that home with Spanish, Greek, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, that influence is strong and becomes stronger. And the sounds that are not in their native language will fall off. But those children, those toddlers, have the capability to produce any sound from any language. A child with a hearing impairment, I'm watching my time, a child with a hearing impairment will begin to babble, even with a hearing impairment. But about 8 months, if they're not getting enough stimulation auditorily, that babbling decreases. And we teach parents to model and model and model so that you can help them to learn the language, especially if you know they're hearing impaired. But because they're not getting that feedback, we know that that babbling decreases. And in some cases, parents don't model quite as much because they're not getting anything back from that child. We know the phoneme that children have the most difficulty with is That's a tough one. It's tongue, it's tension. You have vowels that go with it. R, ear, ire. And so you've got some more of that co-articulation. And it is difficult to correct, but it can be done. Again, that's the speech pathologist. The best indicator for how the sound system is developing is their intelligibility. And some of you use the Communication Milestones booklet from Linguasystems to compare what your child was doing with what they should be doing. And that was exactly what I wanted you to do. You got it. So we look at intelligibility. That's a good indicator of how the sound system is developing. Okay. Wolf and Christian did some research in 1989. They published, and we're going to talk about dialect and accent. They defined dialect, any given variety of a language that's shared by a group of speakers. Shared. So we have this group of people over here, and maybe they're from the South, and they have a dialect. Or people up in the northeastern states, out in the western states. So dialect, any given variety of a language shared by a group of speakers. And it can be standard English speakers or non-standard. Also, according to Taylor, his research in 1990 adds to that, a dialect is a variety of a language that has developed through a complex interplay of historical information, social, political, educational. So all of these extraneous characteristics play into that person's dialect. It's environmental. Dialect and accent aren't genetically based. Like writing isn't genetically based. It's environmentally based. So your dialect and your accent are shaped by the environment. Just because you have a dialect from another country or from another region in the United States doesn't mean it's incorrect. It's not substandard. It's not bad. It's just different based on those extraneous characteristics that make up that particular group of people. It's how they speak. If they understand the rules, then they will be able to communicate quite well with each other. Standard dialect also has a very similar definition. Language spoken by people of relatively high status who have an economic influence as well as political, social, and educational. So we have to look at all those factors that come into play when we analyze culture, dialect, and accent. We really have no absolute standard English because we're all influenced by many different facets within our families. Vernacular dialect is another term for non-standard dialect. It's just another way to say it. But the differences that separate standard and vernacular dialects occurs in grammar, phonology, semantics, pragmatics, syntax, all those 5 language areas that we've talked about all semester. There is a difference. There's a different standard that is used. There's a different hierarchy within cultures. Now, we're going to define the difference between dialect and accent. An accent, and this is in the PowerPoint 142, would be considered characteristics of speech or variations in pronunciation. So the accent is the pronunciation. The dialect is not only the difference in pronunciation, but in the language as well. So you've got to keep those straight because those will be on the final. Accent is pronunciation. The dialect is both pronunciation and language. So the umbrella term is more of dialect, and then accent comes under that. And as I said, it's not biologically based, it's environmentally based. Now, I'm going to conclude here in just a few minutes, right there, because I want to start the next section of chapter 8 talking about 4 social cultural dialects: African American English, Hispanic English, Asian English, and Native American and Alaskan Natives. Okay? What I want you to do before the next session, I don't know that I have that with me, and I apologize. There's a video, I think it's by Harold Wallace III, and it's focusing on code switching or switching codes, and how it's his struggle, and it's on YouTube. If you Google Harold Wallace III, oh, I believe that's his name, and his struggle with culture, and he talks about he talks about switching codes. And I think I maybe put that on Canvas, so I'd like for you to see that first before you watch the second section of chapter 8. I think I'm going to call it chapter 8A and chapter 8B. Okay? So if you could look at that, and then we'll pick up with these 4 social cultural dialects. Keep your fingers crossed that this will upload. All right. See you soon.